Welcome back to the studio. Today, let's look at how to store your leather goods properly. By the end, you'll learn a few things. The first is why leather storage is important. We'll also look at the 8 key elements of leather storage and care, so you know exactly which ones that you could use. And then we'll give you some tips for setting up your leather storage area so it's easy to do and keeps your leather goods looking great. So with that, let's dive right in. Why leather storage is important. So leather is a natural fiber, and it's often exposed to the environment and changes in temperature and humidity, and that can affect the fiber strength and the condition even when it's stored and not in use. And so placing items in proper storage and the right conditions can help maintain that strength and also keep the fibers in good working order, in performance, and also looking good, for a really long time. So even if they're, simple personal accessories, or belts or watch bands and things like that, it can be really easy to store them well, and that'll keep them looking good for a very long time. So let's take a look at a few of the factors that you can use to keep your leather stored properly. The first we're looking at is humidity. And humidity is the amount of moisture that is in the air. So for example, here we've got a hygrometer, which measures humidity. That's the percent here at the bottom. We also have temperature at the top, but the humidity is our focus here. And in general, the amount of moisture content in those leather fibers are going to have an impact on that fiber strength over time. And so a couple of things that we look at are the range and then the maximum and minimum for that humidity. So in general, as moisture is added, the fibers expand. As the moisture leaves, those fibers contract. And so at those extremes, it'll damage the leather in either case. So what do we want to do? We want to keep it at a humidity between 40 and 60% overall. And the maximum at 68%, we start to get swelling. And below 22%, we start to get permanent water loss and shrinkage and damage to those fibers. And so that's why even if items are kept in mostly good conditions, if for short periods of time out in a garage, in a barn, in an attic, if it reaches those extremes, even for a short period, it could start to result in permanent damage to that leather material. So we want to keep it within 40 to 60% of that humidity and an 8% change overall, because as those fibers expand and contract, even if it's daily, if it's too much, it'll start to weaken those fibers over time. And so again, 40 to 60% overall humidity with a basically 8% maximum change and around a 5% maximum daily change. And that'll keep things looking good in the best cases for humidity. Next, we have temperature. So for temperature, we could use a general thermometer. They can be analog thermometers or they could be digital thermometers like this. In this case, the room is 72.5 degrees. And the ideal storage temperature for your leather is going to be around 68 degrees Fahrenheit. That's going to be different for Celsius. Maximum is going to be 77 degrees. And the most fluctuation that you want to have in any given day is going to be around 70 degrees. So your ideal range is 68 with a max of 75 and a low of 61. And too warm could lead to easier drying of that leather. And too large of fluctuations again can lead to expansion and contraction, and that will weaken those fibers too. So even if it's stored well and in a proper, out of sunlight and things like that, if the temperature fluctuations are too much, that can just weaken the fibers even if it's in storage. Light. So dark locations usually work best because the light can actually damage the leather fibers itself if it's too strong. And so usually if you have a dark place, that's going to be great because it limits light exposure. However, if you do want to keep it in some light, then it should be out of direct sunlight for sure, because the sun will damage things. And if it is dyed leather, you want to keep it around 50 lux. And if it is undyed natural leather, you can keep it around 150 lux. What does that mean? So lux are essentially, it's a measure of the strength of, or the intensity of light. And you could use a meter, something like this, where the light goes into this area here, and then it'll give you a reading on the screen as to how many lux that there are, in that light intensity. And so it's an easy way to keep track of where things are, but your best bet is going to be a dark location. Next up, we have the physical spaces that it's stored in. And so there's a lot of different ways you can approach this. Generally, you want it to be dust-free and insect-free and rodent-free, because each of those can eat through those fibers since they're natural. They could use it as a food source, or they may just destroy it in what they're doing or trying to turn it into a house. So if you can keep it dust-free, insect-free, and rodent-free, that will help a lot in terms of preserving the fibers and keeping them strong. Next up, the surface. So we talked about where to put it, and now what to put it on. So generally, we're looking to keep things on a relatively neutral type surface. This could be a clean shelf or drawer, and just ensure that the shelf doesn't have any oils or chemicals on it that can actually infuse into those leather goods and then leave spotting or staining or any kind of a weakening of those fibers. And so keep in mind, because some drawer liners are plastic, some are paper that have acids that are infused in them, just part of the manufacturing process. So what we generally look for are finishes that are more neutral materials. So one good one is a muslin. It's kind of like a cotton fabric that's relatively neutral in its composition. Another good one is acrylic, and acrylic is a relatively stable neutral material that's also used in museum displays pretty often and things like that. And it doesn't have the acids that other plastics do have. So you could find all kinds of acrylic shelves and boxes and cases online and in local stores. So that could be a relatively inexpensive and good way to store it. Another option that we have is acid-free tissue paper. And so what this does is essentially tissue paper that doesn't have the acids used in it during production. And so the acids won't transfer to your leather items because they're simply not there. And so that could be a good buffer to lay it on if you've got a drawer you want to store it in or some other place that you're putting it. And each of these materials can be a good way to provide some protection between your leather item and wherever it is it's being stored. So again, the key ones that we have are going to be your acid-free tissue paper, and that could also be used to wrap things as well if you want to store them. And that way it's providing some type of a buffer between your leather good and the place it's being stored. We also have our acrylic, and we've got our muslin. Another one is airflow. So this could be confusing, as having too much air, too much humidity, can create issues. So here's where the difference is. Airflow can help reduce the growth of mold depending on what else is in the environment. So having some airflow is good. When the air is very stagnant and there is no flow, that actually becomes an easier environment for molds to grow in, which you definitely don't want on our leather. The ideal case, is a dedicated oxygen-free environment, which of course most of us are not going to have in our homes, and that's primarily for use in museums. But in that way, there's no oxygen, oxidation won't occur, and that's the most ideal scenario for leather storage. However, it's not going to be practical, for most of us day to day. So in that sense, the best that we could do is generally have it in a place that has some airflow around it so that it is not stagnant and it will be less likely for mold to grow. And then, just for thoroughness, there is that non-oxygen environment. And storing it in a place that doesn't have oxygen can be the best case scenario. This is found mostly in museums for very valuable items. And a leather object can be stored in a hermetically sealed container, filled with an inert gas, such as nitrogen or helium. And we kind of see an example that could be like that here. And that way reduces the opportunity for oxidation. And so if you've got something that you feel is that important that should be stored like that, if it's like a family heirloom, or if it's something that, is a historically important item, you could always talk to a museum conservator and they could help guide you in, proper methods for storing something like that. But for most of us, we're never going to encounter that at home, but I did want to include it for thoroughness. That way you see, all the elements that can be factors. Now that you know all the details, let's look at what would be most helpful for us day to day. So for most leather items that we've got, we're just going to want to keep them out of direct sunlight in a temperature of around 68 degrees Fahrenheit and a 50% humidity, resting on a neutral surface of muslin or acid-free tissue paper or something else that's relatively neutral in low light. And that's going to basically be a drawer with some tissue paper and the proper humidity and temperature, and that's it. So doing those things can really make a difference in your leather goods and help keep them in good shape for years and decades and even longer. And so now you've got the tips, and that's the basics of leather storage. It's pretty easy to set up a location. Most of us probably have that already. And once you have it set, you just use it and won't have to think about it that much at all. And so if you have any questions, let us know. And if you have any experiences setting up a good leather storage location, let us know. And there you have it. Until next time.